Benvenuti, benvenuti a questa seconda talk di Austin Translation. Ospiteremo il professor Georg Northoff relativamente al suo, farà uno speech relativamente al suo libro appena pubblicato con il Mulino, che appunto è un libro pubblicato in italiano ed è il codice del tempo, il suo titolo. Io sono Daniele Malaguti, sono l'editor di psicologia della società editrice Il Mulino e a me sta il compito di introdurre un po' il libro nel panorama editoriale della nostra produzione e nello stesso tempo appunto di annunciare e di introdurre il professor Northoff che ci parlerà in inglese e ci farà questa lezione in inglese. È possibile anche fare delle domande al professore, già da adesso potete eventualmente, naturalmente durante il suo speech, fargli delle domande. Vi chiederei di farle in inglese così che il professore possa poi rispondere in inglese. Partirei dicendo una cosa che credo sia per me importante e per anche la nostra casa editrice, ed è quella che le neuroscienze sono un elemento della casa editrice molto presente sia nell'ambito accademico sia nell'ambito diciamo del lettore generico e nell'ambito culturale nel suo insieme. Nell'ambito accademico siamo stati tra i primi editori a fare un volume di italiani, un manuale di neuroscienze già poco prima dell'inizio del nuovo millennio, nel 99 con Carlo Umiltà, che raccoglieva però il contributo degli studiosi italiani che poi sono diventati una realtà molto importante di ricerca nel nostro paese, ma non solo, anche all'estero. Questo manuale ha aperto un po' il tema appunto della neuropsicologia, ma nello stesso tempo ha portato poi anche negli anni a parlare, a mettere insieme la neuropsicologia con quelle che sono i modelli psicologici di funzionamento della mente, diciamo, e cervello. E sempre umiltà, assieme a Legrenzi e a Costanza Papagno, hanno scritto un manuale di psicologia generale dove per la prima volta si tentava di integrare le neuroscienze, la neuropsicologia, i fondamenti neuropsicologici dell'attività psichica con i modelli di spiegazione psicologica del funzionamento mentale. Quindi mente e cervello in questo caso entravano in una connessione integrata dove appunto si sosteneva e si sostiene, è un manuale piuttosto recente, come il cervello, come la mente emerga appunto dal cervello, fino ad arrivare diciamo al prossimo futuro in cui la stessa professoressa Papagno con Stracciari a settembre vedremo pubblicato un libro che sarà il primo libro di neurologia comportamentale, quindi dove le neuroscienze vengono interpretate sia con modelli psicologici in un mondo che è quello della neurologia e dei medici. Le scoperte che le neuroscienze hanno fatto in questi anni hanno condotto però a portare il cervello fuori, diciamo, dal mondo dei laboratori per portarlo appunto nel mondo della cultura in generale. Le neuroimmagini sono diventate un elemento che appare sui giornali e hanno anche modificato quello che è il nostro modo di rappresentare il cervello. Neuromania è un'espressione che nasconde anche un dibattito acceso nella ricerca ed è un'espressione internazionale. Però vorrei ricordare che è anche il titolo di un libro che è stato pubblicato dal Mulino con Legrenzi e con Umiltà, ed è anche un'espressione che è nata per la prima volta, grazie anche all'intuizione dell'allora direttore editoriale del Mulino Giovanna Movi, è nata per la prima volta proprio tra le mura della casa editrice. Ed era un libro che portava il tema dell'attenzione alle eccessive forse aspettative che le neuroimmagini potevano portare nel grande pubblico rispetto alla ricerca, e come appunto ci si potesse essere trasportati dall'idea che i neuroni potessero spiegare qualsiasi tipo di comportamento, qualsiasi tipo di emozione, qualsiasi modo di essere, il proprio io sostanzialmente. E ha portato un po' il tema dentro al grande pubblico, ha trasportato il tema al grande pubblico della relazione mente-corpo e soprattutto della relazione mente-cervello. In quegli stessi anni, poco dopo, gli stessi autori produrranno un altro libro che è più recente e che porterà a superare questa idea, o ad affrontarla in un altro modo, in cui si metterà a nudo il fatto che noi come persone siamo tendenzialmente dualisti, cioè tendiamo ad attribuire agli altri la mente e a staccarla da quello che è il cervello, pensando che ci sia una mente, un corpo e diremmo un'anima. E in questo libro, appunto, perché abbiamo bisogno dell'anima, si intitolava, sempre i due autori affrontarono il tema del nostro dualismo innato. Quindi mente-cervello, mente-corpo, natura e cultura è l'altro tema che ispira la nostra produzione, e ispirano questi temi legati al rapporto tra il pensiero, le emozioni, il nostro modo di stare nel mondo, il nostro essere, il nostro io, il nostro sé, si direbbe, e quelle che sono i presupposti neuropsicologici e i meccanismi neuronali che stanno sotto a questa dimensione. E pensando in questi termini qua, ci si potrebbe anche chiedere forse come, se tutto dipende dal cervello, allora, e il cervello è il frutto dei nostri geni, allora tutto è determinato geneticamente. Questo è un altro tema che si è posto e abbiamo posto al grande pubblico, e che ha trovato in un altro autore del Mulino, Lamberto Maffei, una risposta legata alla plasticità neuronale in un altro testo che si intitolava appunto La libertà di essere diversi. Questi sono gli spunti editoriali, questi sono i temi che abbiamo affrontato negli anni, sia in ambito accademico, diciamo, e come anche nell'ambito della lettura per un pubblico allargato, non specialista. Questi temi editoriali, da questi temi editoriali, diciamo che il libro di Georg Northoff è un libro che in questi temi si inserisce e che porta il tema del funzionamento appunto cerebrale, della relazione non solo tra mente e cervello, ma della relazione tra cervello e corpo. Tiene conto di altri temi che si sono sviluppati nel tempo, dal riduzionismo al determinismo, fino appunto, come dicevamo, alla dinamica tra natura e cultura. Northoff in questo libro, tuttavia, presenta un punto di vista che a mio avviso è differente e oserei dire anche di svolta. Prendendo il tempo come punto di partenza per affrontare questi grandi temi, l'autore dà un'ottica originale che mette insieme le diverse anime che popolano proprio la crescita nella sua carriera di studioso, e che l'hanno percorso fino ad oggi. Dobbiamo infatti tenere presente che Georg Northoff è uno psichiatra, è un neuroscienziato ed è anche un filosofo. È un filosofo, è un europeo, perché Georg Northoff appunto è cresciuto, è nato e cresciuto appunto in Germania. E queste anime quindi della psicologia clinica, delle neuroscienze, della filosofia, entrano in gioco in questa sua ultima opera ed entra anche in gioco, credo, ma lui stesso me l'ha dato conferma mentre parlavamo di questa presentazione, entrano anche in gioco la cultura fenomenologica dentro la quale è cresciuto e che trovano in questa opera, tutte queste anime, non solo una proposta originale ma una loro integrazione. Il cervello qui non è più inquadrato unicamente nella sua scatola cranica, ma collocato in relazione sia con il proprio corpo, da una parte, per primo, sia con il proprio ambiente. Poi questo dialogo si allarga e restituisce una visione della natura umana come un tutt'uno, un insieme che entra in relazione proprio con il proprio ambiente, al punto da coniare il termine neuroecologia. L'autore alla fine del suo libro appunto ne parla e lo affronta. Direi che mi fermo qui. I spoke enough. I leave now the scene to Georg Northoff, to the author, reading to listen to him with you. Thanks, Georg, to being here, and I leave you the speech.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you to you, Daniele, and also to the publisher, to Il Molino, for the excellent supervision and also for this option for this book and the talk. I'm very happy to give my talk. Maybe we can upload the first slide. Yeah, perfect. So here you see a very busy slide, and actually my first question as a philosopher, I'm entitled to ask some basic question. How can the brain as gray pipey mass yield something as colorful as our mind? The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer in the 19th century spoke of the brain as a gray pulpy mass. And the question is, how can it yield mental features like the sense of self, like consciousness, like psychiatric disorders, or the loss of consciousness? So everything which we usually take for granted, there is a certain neuronal machinery, and as Daniele pointed out, most likely a neuroecological mechanism behind. And here you see on the left the famous movie by Frankenstein in the 80s, and highly recommended for you to download. The movie is really, at its time, was of course a science fiction. However, some of that, to reconstruct brains, to reconstruct minds, is at least discussed in the vicinity of artificial intelligence, and maybe in my answer to some of the questions, so I will allude to that. However, despite all the knowledge we have assembled about the brain, we haven't really cracked what makes a brain a brain. There was this beautiful book by your publisher, Neuromania, which really very nicely pointed out the over-interpretation, the almost manic interpretation of some of these findings. And the question is whether really empirical findings tell us something about the natural world as such. Philosophers call it ontology. And in the brain, we have an amazing set of data in the last 20, 30 years. We have all these beautiful brain imaging techniques, fMRI, EEG, but we haven't really, maybe I can have the slide back, we haven't really cracked the code of the brain. So what do I mean by code? So just imagine, some of you may know that the genetic code wasn't cracked until the mid of last century. It wasn't really clear what inheritance consists in and what a gene is. That was cracked by Watson and Crick when he found out these are 4 particular proteins, and they assemble to each other in various sequences. That's the genetic code. Going back even a little bit earlier, in the Second World War, Alan Turing cracked the code of the German army, and that contributed a lot to the defeat, fortunately. A more recent example, somebody told me, you know that everything is now electronically, you get everything a code, you need an access code, and somebody bought a refrigerator. And then, of course, also with the code, certain number code you have to put in, and she forgot the code. And then she asked the company where she bought it, they also lost the code. So after all, she could never open her refrigerator, and she had to buy a new refrigerator. So meaning, the code is somewhat important, not only for our food in the refrigerator, but also for our mind. And that we currently don't know. The code is a basic principle according to which something operates. And for instance, can be opened like the refrigerator or the genetic code along the lines it works. We don't know that, and that's the question I'm trying to address in this book. And my hypothesis is, based on various philosophical, neuroscientific, and psychiatric considerations, is that time plays a key role in providing the code. Next slide, please. Yeah, so time is the brain's code. That's basically the main assumption of my talk, and also, as you see, the title of the book. So does this mean if the code of the brain is temporal, does that mean that we need to understand the mind, like sense of self, consciousness, and psychiatric disorders, also in temporal terms? This sounds very strange to us, because time for us is just something very basic. However, we have learned from philosophy, from Descartes on, and it's basically transferred into our time, that the mind is something special. So meaning, of course, we don't have the Cartesian dualism anymore, but we still assume specific mechanisms, specific regions in the brain accounting for consciousness, or a specific process like integration, specific region, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, as postulated in some of the theories of consciousness these days. So the specialness is still there. The mind is something special. Now it's just something special within the brain itself. However, is that really the code of the brain? And then everything that is special / the mind in the brain is different from everything that is non-special in the brain. So basically, we have a dualistic brain. That cannot be, because nature and evolution is not as stupid to create basically a special and a non-special brain. It's much easier. So that's why I said time. So time, something very basic. Next slide. Then, of course, the question, what is time? So you open another Pandora's box, Dr. Northoff. What on earth are you doing here, Dr. Northoff? You cannot do this. Time has a long history, even longer than the mind. It goes back to the ancient Greek. Yeah, and you see here, it's Chronos. Chronos was the father of time. And Chronos was associated with temporal continuity, like the older age, temporal continuity from the past over the present, and you see the future is cut off. Yeah, so from the past over the present to the future. So imagine a river flowing steadily. That's the kind of temporal continuity which is associated with Chronos. Next slide. However, as you know, thank you for the future. I'm grateful. However, there was also Kairos. Kairos had a different view of time. Yeah. Kairos said, okay, maybe it's more moments in time. Yeah. And interestingly, both views of time, Chronos and Kairos, are still present in the current philosophical discussion. It's called, for the specialists among you, presentism, and versus a block view of time. So time itself is very heterogeneous. Next slide, please. So let's go a little bit into that, because that is really key. This is really the basics, and this goes also closely aligns with physics and the view of time. We usually in psychology and neuroscience associate time with discrete points in time. You see here the green points. These are a number of moments or discrete points in time. And there's no connection between them. This is the way we perceive time. So I look outside here, I see the beautiful blue sky, I see white snow, because after all, I'm in Canada. Fortunately, I don't feel the temperature because that is -15. So it's really beautiful at a particular moment in time. For instance, the plant. I see the plant at a particular moment in time. However, I was recently told that plants are also moving. I don't see that moving. Yeah? So meaning Kairos times is a little limited number of moments at operating at discrete points in time. However, you will see slightly weak here, the green. Our mind is not just temporal discontinuous, but it shows a continuous, for instance, a stream of consciousness. Our consciousness is never interrupted. It always goes on. It's like the flowing river beneath the ships. The ships are at discrete points in time. The flowing river is beneath, is constantly going. So does this mean that our mind is more temporal continuous than discontinuous and goes more with Chronos than with Kairos? Next slide. That is not true either, because I can react very fast at a particular moment in time. And you, I assume, or at least I hope so, you can follow my speech. Yeah? So you can follow my speech, you have to follow my movement, and that's, I can move very fast, I can speak very fast, and I can vary my speech frequency, my speed, and then I can speak faster, and I can speak faster again, and you see I also vary my intensity, and you can follow all that. So that means there are different time scales involved. A very long, steady time scale when I speak like this, and a faster time scale when I speak like this. And your brain can apprehend that, and even better, your brain can connect all these time scales. That is the amazing feat of the brain. And that is also one feat which is lacking in current artificial intelligence. The current agents, even the reinforcement learning, as advanced as it is, the reinforcement learning, which, for instance, beats the Go world champion, the South Korean world champion, also beats the chess champion, Garry Kasparov. I don't think that they are yet to beat Magnus Carlsen, the current champion. However, you see the brain combines different time scales. The current artificial intelligence only has a very limited number of time scales. So that's the amazing, and we can adapt. We can integrate the faster time scale with the slower time scale. Yeah, we have a temporal continuity of ourselves over time, over months, over weeks, over years, and we can still link that to a very short time scale where we just see something, this is related to ourselves. That's an amazing thing, and we are often not aware of. And you will see later that if these different time scales are not properly integrated, we suffer mentally from it. So meaning the brain likes both Chronos and Kairos. It integrates temporal continuity and discontinuity. And you see this here. I overlap the moments in time, different time scales, and ultimately we experience that as a stream of consciousness. So again, my analogy, imagine a river, flowing water, and you have ships on it. Your brain can do both. Yeah, and that's amazing thing. Temporal integration, having different time scales, linking them together, and in 99% of all the cases, it usually works quite well. Yeah. So, and that's what makes our brain apparently so adaptive. Next slide, please. So I showed you a little bit about the background, what I mean by time. So I mean here by time, not the time how we perceive and cognize this, but how our brain constructs the time, and that's the time we experience. So, and I show you now different examples of that, how time shapes and is manifest in different mental phenomena. The first thing here, I go against the clock. I start with a sense of self. You see down there, you see yourself in the mirror, that our self is not a higher order cognitive function as often relayed by philosophers also in current neuroscience. No, it's the most basic temporal dynamics of our mind and how it relates to the environment. Then I show you an example how brain and body communicate. And you will see here I bring the example of the heart. So I will not speak about love. I only speak about the love between the brain and the heart, not the mental love. How they coordinate, how they communicate, that's via time. Then I bring you an example about consciousness. You'll be surprised. Consciousness ultimately can be traced to how the brain can communicate with its environment. Yeah, and then fourth example, I will bring you some examples from psychiatric disorders. The next slide, please. First, a little bit about the brain itself. Brain has its own time. As we all know, our brain has its own mind. I perceive things very differently, and when I'm extremely under stress, I might have a distorted perception of reality. So and ultimately, this sort of subjective perception might be related to a different construction of time. So in our brain, this is important, it's basically like this, he said. You go out now from Italy, probably some Germans might already take a swim, but for you it's way too cold, of course I know. But when I'm in March, end of March in Italy, I like to take a swim too, because after all, I'm German in my background. So here, and what you see when you go to the seaside, you see some big, powerful waves. Yeah, the surfer loves that because finally she or he can surf. And these waves are so powerful that you're really afraid that you might be smashed by them on the beach. However, then you see also some faster waves, which are not as low. You don't take them seriously. But also they don't surf for surfing. So you need the big waves to surf it. Particularly when you go to Hawaii, you see fantastic big waves, but they're very powerful, so dangerous. So same in the brain. You see in the lower left, you see a brain hidden, and that's basically the neuronal activity. The black stuff. It's the neuronal activity, and what is important, the neuronal activity continuously fluctuates. It's continuously changing. Yeah, and I will tell you later, when the brain is no longer changing in its neuronal activity, is bad news. Very bad news. Yeah. So, and it fluctuates in different speeds. A little slower. That's what we call the slow wave oscillation. You see on the bottom infraslow, which you can measure with fMRI. And then you see also faster frequencies, which we can measure with EEG. I spare you the details of this. But what is important here, like in the sea, like in the ocean, the slow waves in the brain, the slow fluctuations are very powerful. Yeah? And the faster fluctuations are not as powerful. Keep that in mind, because what will come out later in the next slides, that this balance is very important. Next one. Yeah, here you see already now the first application of that. So when you look at the upper slide, you see on the lines with the two brains, what do you see there? I tell you. So on the horizontal line in those graphs, you see the frequency. Left is slow, right is fast. Yeah. And on the vertical line, you see the power. So, and you see that when you're on the left of the horizontal line, you have very high power. While if you're on the right, you have the faster frequencies, the faster waves, they're not as powerful. I told you, the brain is nothing but a C wave. But C waves. What else? You see much more here. You also see that each of these lines is one subject. You see how different the different subjects are. Some has a little bit more power in the slower frequency relative to the faster. The other one is the other way around, and so on. And you see different constellations. No wonder that the steepness of these waves, the relative balance between slow and fast power, predicts our sense of self. I don't show the correlation graphs here, but this is what we found, and already in the spontaneous activity. So your brain, the way it continuously fluctuates, slow, fast, powerful, less powerful, that reflects your sense of self. So that gives you what we call a multi-scale or scale free. Your brain is your change across different time scales, shorter and faster. And how well these fluctuations are coordinated, that determines your degree of self. If the fluctuation is more shifted towards a slower wave, you have a stronger sense of self. The more slow and powerful waves relative to the faster ones, the stronger our sense of self. So basically the self is basically like, now you see lower right, you see it's like a surfer on the different waves. The better you can integrate these different waves, slow and fast time scales, the better your sense of self. And that really goes with our reality. Our self is always present. In the short moment, when you react very angry, this is of course highly self-related, and I don't need to tell you, this is something which psychoanalysis worked out very well, that this is related to the deeper unconscious layers, and also in the longer term, temporal stability. And we all see that is also dependent upon the external environmental context, as we now see in the current COVID times, where the external time has extremely slowed. Yeah. So suddenly you need to fill in the external change by some internal change in order not to get completely bored. Yeah. So you see that internal time constructed by your brain and the external time by the environment are closely related with each other. Yeah. So they shape each other. And I will bring you more examples of that later. One last remark to this slide. You also see that two different regions there. Upper left, you see MPFC is the medial prefrontal cortex. This is a region which is here in the front of the brain. This is basically when you say, my God, this Northoff talks too long. And then you see the posterior cingulate. You see that the curves for these two regions are also different. Meaning the different regions in the brain are very individual in their temporal pattern. Each contributes something, a slightly different time scale. They overlap, but also contribute something different. So it's like a group of, let's say, 360 people, each, or like in parliament, each member of parliament contributing something different. So, and this integration between different time scales, slow and fast, the balance, that's your sense of self. It's like the surfer on the wave. Next slide, please. So I showed you the first example of time mediating the relationship between brain and self being manifested. Now, the next example, brain and body. How do brain and body communicate? There's a lot of research in recent years about brain-heart communication and how we perceive our heartbeat. And you all know this. When you run like crazy, you may perceive your heartbeat much more strongly than when you just walk. Yeah, or you know the extreme cases of people who have a panic attack who think they have a heart attack. So how do they communicate? Again, I say there's a temporal code. They communicate with the waves and the rhythm. It's like dancing a tango. Next slide, please. Yeah, and it's basically like a tango, and I tell you here. Let me explain you this graph here. You see in the lower part, you see the heart. And you see the typical, what is called electrocardiograph, EKG. You see there's a wave, that's one heartbeat. So the lower line there, you see the green arrow, that's basically a heartbeat. And then look, the brain at exactly the same time of the heartbeat, the brain also has a beat. Is this a brain beat? Yeah, this is crazy. Yeah. So your heart, your brain is synchronizing its activity to the temporal course of the heart. And then the heartbeat is basically sent throughout the different regions of the brain. That's what you can see in the upper. Sort of the activity wanders through the different regions of the brain and changes a little bit here, a little bit there. So it's like a resonance effect. Yeah, if somebody one member of parliament says something, then the all other 360 might also react and say something. Yeah, so there's a temporal resonance, and basically, I often like to bring the example of like a tango when two people dance to the tango. Here, brain and heart dance to the same rhythm. So, and they communicate. Next slide. And if this communication doesn't work well, then you get into problems. That's what I want to show you now. So here on the left, you see again the remarkable synchronization of brain and heart. I find it always amazing, even I who have now seen it very many times, it's amazing, the timing. Yeah. And you see here again, lower, you see the heart. Yeah. And then you see also in the upper on the left, I'm on the left here now. I know you can't see my fingers on the screen. On the left, so you see again what is called intertrial phase coherence. So basically the degree of temporal synchronization between brain and heart. You can measure that in the brain. And it's remarkable. You see with the onset of the heartbeat, you see in the lower left, you see then in the brain, you see the yellow and the red color with the green arrow indexed, and you can really see that there the brain becomes more synchronous in its activity. So meaning the heart exerts a synchronizing effect upon the brain. So that, of course, you would assume the heart must be somehow rhythmic. When the two tango dance, when suddenly the one loses her or his rhythm, then the other one suffers, and the other one doesn't know where to go if the one is irregular. So what do? So you lose the degree of synchronization. And I show you here upper right a consequence of that. So you have people with a heart rhythm disorder, like atrial fibrillation, when they have a very irregular heartbeat. And we investigated these people and these people's brain. And we looked for the degree to which the brain can synchronize with the heartbeat in the heart, in these irregular heart beating people. And you see this on the upper left, meaning, upper right. You see on the very right, you see the healthy control. It's very red. 0 is the onset of the heartbeat. Very red, that means the brain really synchronizes with the onset of the heartbeat. In the left, in the heart rhythm disorder subjects, you don't see as much red, meaning the brain doesn't know how to synchronize because the heart beats in a very irregular way. What is the consequence? That these people with atrial fibrillation show anxiety and depression. So if you desynchronize brain and body, it affects your mind, meaning you experience anxiety and depression. However, there's a two-way road. There's also the road from brain to heart. So I only showed you that the heart is irregular. Now maybe the brain might become irregular and it can't synchronize with the otherwise regular heartbeat. That's what you typically see, particularly in anxiety and especially in panic disorder. So panic disorders are patients who come in very dramatic. Everybody thinks this must be a heart attack. And the patient is convinced, I have a heart attack. So all the medical doctors come, EKG, everything is done, and they don't find anything. And then they don't know what's going on. And the last resort for every medical discipline is always when they don't know what's going on. Who is it? The last resort? The psychiatrist. Then the psychiatrist comes in and is relaxed. It's a panic attack. We know all that. And then she or he talks with the patient, calm down, because often there's a life event in the background causing that. And what you can see in these anxiety patients, you see a desynchronization between brain and heart. Yeah, so that the brain cannot synchronize. Then you lose control, your unconscious control over your heart. You become afraid. And that causes panic. So the emotional reaction is very normal, given what happened before. So again, you see it's about timing, linking brain and mind. Next slide, please. Here, time provides our brain interface with the environment. So if I listen to music, I need to adapt to the fast rhythm of the music. And you listen to my speech, I try to speak not too fast and a little slower. So you adapt to the time scales. You probably use the same time scales in which I deliver my speech. You probably use the same time scales in your brain. And external environment changes fast. So you need the faster time scales. If you lose the faster time scales, it's probably bad news for your consciousness. Next slide. So this is an investigation which was done by Federico Silio in Pavia, which just published. It's an Italian student of mine, actually originally a philosopher, but now he also does neuroscience. So he did a very clever thing. He investigated the time scales in people with different states of consciousness. In the different stages of sleep, you see upper left, this nice visual graph here, and he did this graph together with Javier Gomez Pilar in Spain. Then he also investigated the middle upper line in anesthesia, awake state, fully anesthesia state, and then you also see it's covered there is the in patients with coma. What did he find? He found, so he did an EEG, the electrical activity in the brain, and he saw that the electrical activity becomes much slower. Yeah, you have only the faster time, the slower time scales. You see this in the middle line, that the power of the slower frequencies gets higher and higher, and the power of the faster frequencies gets lower and lower. Meaning you lose the faster frequency. You completely lose them in consciousness. You have only a very long line, you see, and now you go to the lower, you see this in the pink, you see that line is much slower. Yeah, so imagine a wave, a sea which is completely silent. From time to time, you have a little wave because there's a little breeze of wind, and that's it. Otherwise, you stay there and say, wow, today it's really calm and quiet. That's your brain when you lose consciousness. So meaning when the sea is alive, you have a lot of small waves, you have chaos, faster, slower waves, somewhat coordinated. That's the awake state. That's when you have consciousness. When the sea is very silent and calm and nothing happens, it cannot adapt to its external environment anymore. It changes. So your brain loses the connection to the environmental context. It cannot synchronize with the music. It cannot synchronize with the heartbeat anymore because these are all fast inputs. You have to react fast. You cannot follow my speech anymore. Maybe you're already drowsy and asleep because your slow waves take over and you don't have enough fast wave anymore to follow my speech. So maybe I need to speak a little slower to keep you awake. Yeah, and that's most amazing. He also investigated, this was a very clever idea, he also investigated patients who still have consciousness, but in a very unfortunate condition, what is called locked-in syndrome. So their motor system is completely depleted, like an amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. It's a really bad condition, it's a muscular disease. But the consciousness is still preserved. And what he saw that here, the time scale, the faster time scales were still present. Yeah, that is the lower green line you see. So despite the fact that they could not move anymore, their consciousness was preserved because the fast time scales were still there in relation to the slower. So you see time also mediates the relationship between environment, context, and brain. Next slide, please. So remember the thought, remember the self. The self was the balance between slower and faster frequencies. If the balance tilted a little bit towards the slower frequency at the expense of the faster, you have higher self-consciousness. So now, what happens if that balance tilts to an extreme? Meaning, it's really, there's still faster frequency, unlike when you lose consciousness, but your slower frequencies are relatively much stronger. You become depressed. You see the upper left. So meaning your brain is in a way too slow. Yeah, it's the slow-fast relation is shifted towards the slower side. Fast is still there, but it's underrepresented. So, and interestingly, this is really new data here. We just published one paper about this, that the neuronal activity in your visual input region, here the blue region, you see on the right, the brain, and you see the blue regions there, that's your visual cortex. That's where you perceive the input. Many patients in severe depression have the feeling that everything is gray. Yeah, they don't perceive color, they can't perceive the fast changes in the environment, they feel too slow. So here we tested that hypothesis, whether if the subjects perceive their environment in themselves as too slow, then their neuronal activity should also be too slow. And that's exactly what we see here in the occipital or visual regions of the brain. The neuronal activity is too slow. So this was done by Andrea Scalabrini in Milano, who's actually a neuroscientist and a psychotherapist, and we do wonderful work together. And in the bottom, you see, this is something we did. You see, so this was a visual task which we let subjects perform, depressed and healthy subjects. And when you have the feeling that something is that you're too slow, how do you perceive things? You perceive them in a more blurry way. If the bus in front of you is driving extremely fast and you cannot follow, you just perceive them in a very blurry way. And you're not sure, was there really a bus passing by? Yeah, because, probably, sorry, it's not a bus in Italy, it's a Ferrari in Italy. Sorry, I should have known that earlier. So you have the feeling that the Ferrari is passing by and it's so fast that you cannot follow. And of course, you're in Italy, you assume it's a Ferrari, but you're not sure because it's too fast. However, if the Ferrari would drive a little slower, which of course goes against the nature of Ferrari drivers, then you would perceive it in a non-blurry way. Same here now in depression. When your visual brain gets too slow, they perceive the pictures in front of them in a more blurry way. And that's what I show here on the lower right. You see they got a pattern in the task. This is really based on data. We reconstructed that from the real data, basically developed a blurriness index. And you see that the depressed patient perceives the same pattern in a much more blurry way. So what happens if you have the feeling that you're always too slow and everything is blurry and you're not sure? What do? You withdraw. I give you a little bit short history and then I will come to the last slides. So I had once a patient who came with her mother and she was completely mute, meaning she didn't speak at all. She was severely depressed. And the mother spoke normal speech and was not that talkative, but normal. So then after the depression, I asked the patient, why didn't you speak? She said, my mother, I knew that she knew on a cognitive level, my mother spoke normal speed for her, but for me it was too fast. I couldn't follow, and then I had nothing to say. Yeah. So here you see a desynchronization between the mother and the daughter, because the daughter perceived the mother's otherwise normal speedy speech as too fast, because her own brain was too slow. So here you see if your brain is too slow relative to the environment, you cannot follow, and literally based here on real data, you perceive the world as too blurry. Next slide. Again, time is the code between the brain. So I come to my last slides. So I hope I gave you some example. Time is key in mediating brain activity into mind activity. And different mental features I touched upon self, I touched upon the consciousness, I touched upon the brain-heart connection, anxiety disorder, panic, heart rhythm disorder. They all lead to major mental changes. So that I say, maybe time holds the key to understand brain-mind relation, and even more extended world-brain-mind relation, including our self and consciousness and mental disorders. So maybe time is a shared feature between world, brain, and mind. And you see, I'm coming here back to Chronos, and also I should have put in Kairos here too, because your brain operates across different time scales. There's a multitude, an amazing multitude of time scales where even artificial intelligence is not coming close. And the integration of these time scales may hold the key why neuronal activity transforms into mental activity. And the next slide, which I think is the last slide. And so I hope the message is clear. Time understood in a dynamic way, continuously change, the pattern of change, which we just start to analyze, might hold a key for the code of the brain, mind, and its relationship to the world. And again, I want to say thank you to Il Molino, thank you to Daniele Malaguti, thank you for the publisher, also thank you for making this possible, and also thank you for the audience that before your nice and good Italian food and pasta, you took the time to listen to the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Georg. Grazie davvero, Georg. Davvero nel tuo speech hai toccato solo una parte, ma una parte penso importante del modello che appunto ci proponi. We have time just for one question, Georg, and this is the first one I put in the chat. Abbiamo il tempo solo per una domanda, e la domanda ha a che fare con awareness, cioè con la consapevolezza. Northoff, nella domanda che ci arriva, dice appunto ha trovato una relazione tra le onde lente e il sé. Nella meditazione la consapevolezza è importante e sembra che possa facilitare la consapevolezza. Pensi che ci sia una relazione tra il modo in cui funziona il cervello e la meditazione, e in che modo c'è una relazione between meditation and self-awareness?
Yeah, very, very good question. So I have a lifelong interest in meditation. I'm also often in Asia. I always wanted to conduct a meditation study. And finally, we did this now, and we investigated proficient versus non-proficient meditator. And also now we have a data set from Kirti, from Laura Marchetti. So thank you to her. So what happens in meditation? Your whole brain is spatially reorganized. So regions where you become aware of yourself and just focus on yourself, that activity is a little bit diminished. The whole brain is somewhat more synchronized. Interesting. So the differences between self and non-self are no longer as strong in the brain. And I think that mirrors very well the meditation experience. Now, even more interesting, you see more synchronization between the faster regions and the slower regions. So they're more synchronized, meaning I can better integrate my environmental input with my own self. And what we also observe, and this is key, that apparently the repertoire, the dynamic, the scale, the range of the time scales my brain can take on is much wider and much more fine-grained in meditation. So that's probably related to the fact that you perceive things in a more fine-grained and wider way, more intense, with less of a difference between your own self and the non-self. So you basically better immerse with the larger timescales of your environmental context, because obviously the world has a much wider range of timescales than the brain. So apparently meditation unleashes some blockades which the brain put in place in order to preserve the own self as distinguished from the non-self. So meditation seems to go on a deeper layer of neuronal activity. And indeed, there is support for that. Like here, the kind of measures the balance between slow and faster frequency changes. Some of the measures are integrate, brain-heart synchronization becomes better. So many of these temporal key parameters. So it's real. So it basically, the brain in meditation can much better dance the tango with the environment, yeah, and the own body. So now you know what you have to do tonight. Yeah.
Ok, siamo arrivati alla fine, vi ringrazio tutti quanti di aver partecipato, so anche numerosi, a questo speech. Thank you Northoff for being here, grazie al professor Northoff per essere stato qui e per essere stato un nostro autore. Il libro infatti non è tradotto da un editore straniero, ma è un libro che Northoff ha scritto proprio per il Mulino. Era già stato autore del Mulino, curatore del Mulino con un altro libro, La plasticità del sé, curato con la dottoressa Marina Farinelli, con Franco Baldoni e con Rabicciat, sempre per il Mulino, appunto. Vi do appuntamento per il prossimo speech, che sarà il 24 marzo, sempre alle ore 18. Ci saranno Anne Case e Angus Deaton. Angus Deaton è il premio Nobel per l'economia e faranno una talk sull'ultimo libro che è appena uscito per il Mulino da noi, ed è Morti per disperazione, il futuro del capitalismo. Buona serata a tutti e grazie ancora di essere stati qui.